Hi, good morning, and welcome to this week's edition of The Week Ahead. For me, it's really always been about the minimum wage. It's minimum wage all the time. As some of you are aware, the newspapers reported last Thursday the Maine House of Representatives took up the issue of the referendum question submitted by the Maine People's Alliance that would raise the minimum wage to $12 an hour, eliminate the tip credit currently utilized by the restaurant industry, and index the minimum wage on an annual basis after 2020. The Maine State Chamber of Commerce is part of a coalition of more than 17 statewide business associations that have worked to try and convince the legislature that there's a better way, that there's a more reasonable alternative for this state, that Maine can enact a minimum wage increase that is sustainable and meaningful without hurting the small business economy of our state. We've pushed a $10 an hour competing measure in the House of Representatives, and that issue came up on Thursday. Unfortunately, we were not successful at our first try. We lost in the House 78 to 69. I want to thank all the legislators who stood with us on this issue. Almost the entire Republican caucus, one Democrat representative, Marty Groman from Biddeford, and some of the independents. This issue now resides in the Senate. It's on the calendar today. I don't believe it's going to come up right away. In the interim, the LCRED committee met on Thursday afternoon, and in a process that's usual at the end of the session where bills that they've held on to, they're simply killing off. One of them was a vehicle for potentially revisiting the question of a competing measure, and Representative Sue Austin from Gray New Gloucester took out a minority report that will present that question to the legislature once again. So we will be discussing this at least a couple more times in the House and the Senate. We hope we'll be able to convince a handful of Democrat legislators that this is the right thing to do for the state and the economy, and we will keep our members informed. For those of our members and those members of local chambers of commerce, we would highly encourage you to continue to reach out to your locally elected officials and encourage them to support the idea of including a competing measure. We are content to let the people choose on this issue. We think they'll choose a more reasonable alternative. We just need to give them the opportunity to do it.
Absolutely. In my world, taxation, we have one bill left, tax havens. That's the LD 1634, and it would basically propose to tax operations that Maine companies have in other certain jurisdictions around the world. So that is been tabled in the Senate. Expected to come up maybe today.
And that was they dealt with this last session already.
Yeah, last session it was rejected, so overwhelmingly. So.
And this is the funding mechanism that they want to use to fund the clean election campaigns,
right? And the Republicans want to see it come out of the general fund. The Democrats want to enact the tax haven legislation. So we're supporting obviously the Republican proposal, which is the amendment to the bill. But I'm expecting this is going to be a party line vote.
Well, and if it's a party line vote, the options are fairly limited. If people want extra money to go into the clean election fund, I mean,
right.
At that point it becomes either you don't get any or it's going to end up coming from the general fund.
Right. I mean, the language in the referendum was really kind of, it didn't really define what corporate tax expenditures could be, and that was the problem. It could be anything that the state has on the books right now for tax expenditures.
Well, no, the legislature hasn't taken the time to try and figure out what are low functioning economic development.
And OPEG is currently right now in the process of doing that review. So until they do that review, we're not going to know.
And these are all the criticisms we had of the question when it was up in November.
Right.
So.
Right. So hopefully it dies between the houses at this point, or the Republican proposal is enacted, which funds it through the general fund, which it ought to be funded through the general fund, especially now since they have a huge surplus.
Well, we'll wait and see what happens on both issues. So thank you for joining us for this week's edition of The Week Ahead, and we'll talk to you next week.